My name is Kathleen Morrison. I'm a professor of anthropology here at the University of Chicago, and I think somehow I've become the master of ceremonies for today's event. So I'm very pleased indeed to be able to welcome today to the 500th Convocation of the University Robert McCormick Adams, a distinguished anthropologist, archaeologist, and scholar of the ancient Middle East. I was told to keep this introduction short, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do in this case. Many of us are very familiar with the work of Bob Adams and the remarkable career, but for those who are not, he was born in Chicago, here in Chicago in 1926. He received all three of his degrees from the University of Chicago, receiving his PhD in 1956. He has a boatload of honorary degrees, which I won't mention. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and many, many more kinds of distinguished awards. He was a member of the faculty from 1955 to 1984 in the Oriental Institute, the Department of Anthropology, Near East Languages and Civilizations, and the Committee on Public Policy Studies. He was Harold H. Swift Distinguished Service Professor from 1975 to 1984, and Director of the Oriental Institute between 1962 and 68, and then again from 81 to 83. He was Dean of the Division of Social Sciences, 1970 to 74, and 79 to 80, and Provost of the University of Chicago, 1982 to 1984, leaving only to become Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution from 1984 to 1994. He currently serves as Adjunct Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, San Diego. He's been very deeply involved in governance of various sorts, as you can tell from that CV, particularly in the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council. He's currently a trustee of the National Opinion Research Center of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Santa Fe Institute, Morehouse College, the American University in Beirut, and I could just continue, but I want to actually say something very briefly, a little more substantive about the work as well. Bob Adams' pioneering work on early urban societies in Mesopotamia and his comparative analysis of early complex society across the world, I'd say, inspired generations of scholars, not just here at Chicago, but across the world. And it left a really enduring legacy, particularly an empirical and methodological legacy on the field. Right from the beginning, one of his early articles, a very influential 1958 article with Thorkild Jacobson, published in Science, called Salt and Silt, Problems of Irrigation Agriculture in Ancient Mesopotamia. Adams established a trademark style that applied innovative archaeological research to broad and important issues in anthropology, in history, and development, a kind of application to contemporary problems that I think those of us in the field would do well to emulate today. His two books, The Land Behind Baghdad in 1965 and The Uruk Countryside in 1972, really forever changed the way archaeologists approach regional analysis, introducing new ways of approaching the material record. And I still remember in the early 80s in graduate school my delight in scoring used copies of The Land Behind Baghdad and The Uruk Countryside from a used bookstore. And we were very excited to get a hold of those. Equally important were his comparative works, such as The Evolution of Urban Societies, which was published in 1966, which really brought together anthropological perspectives on social organization, kinship, and economy, as well as environmental data to bear on problems of state formation. The kinds of themes from this book emerged again in later work, including a very influential paper before the American Philosophical Society that employed concepts of stability and resilience from population biology, concepts that have had considerable purchase in the field ever since. The critical historical interactions between human beings and their environment and the implications of those histories for the present were very much highlighted in Adams' 1981 masterpiece, The Heartland of Cities, as in a rather different way in his 1996 book, Paths of Fire, an anthropologist's inquiry into the making of the modern West. So his influence on archaeology and anthropology and really so many fields, ancient Near Eastern studies, has been, I think, rather like his groundbreaking survey work. It's both deep and broad. It's very wide-ranging. It crosses disciplines, indeed. So on behalf of the university and the Department of Anthropology, we're very pleased to be able to host today Bob Adams, anthropologist, scientist, humanist, educator, administrator, polymath, and in many ways, as I understand, former editor of the Maroon, and in many ways, very much a product of the University of Chicago. Welcome.
I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Kathy just covered, but I'm going to do so in a somewhat different mood and a more reflective one, perhaps, and it ends up in a somewhat different place than where she describes it. I should say at this point, colleagues, friends, it's good to be back in this room, but in this campus again, and it's good to be here with you. Chicago, when I first encountered it as a young Navy veteran just back from the China coast in 1946, was exactly what I was looking for. A maze of pathways leading out into the world and never look back into the beginnings. There was a sense of defiance about a serious pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, which was much used at that time, as I recall, that I thrilled to think about. Do I still today thrill at that, so to speak? Or do I wonder if we are all now in a different, more mundane, accommodative place? Do we ever remember or merely mythologize about our own beginnings? Do we ever think about, in fact, when we began to compartmentalize ourselves? I suppose that's the question that I'm asking. What I recall most about anthropology at Chicago was its lack of established routines, its permissiveness. Who could be against non-judgmental cultural relativism was sort of the attitude of the time, and it was one that I fully subscribed to. Anthropology with some semblance of unity was at that point coming together to a degree at least around the idea of capital C culture. I was never in that company. What attracted me was the field's eclecticism. Among my fellow students were a lot of interesting, disparate, and certainly valuable people. It was an attraction rather than a repellent, that there didn't seem to be a lot of coherence and togetherness. Instead, there was intriguing vagueness, even indifference about disciplinary boundaries. I think I need my glasses. The light is not, maybe no better than it was when I was running this place. Simultaneously, however, my interests were also drawn across University Avenue to the Oriental Institute. There was a faculty bridge in the person of Robert Braidwood, who held joint appointments. But the social sciences and the humanities, no, these aren't helping any, I'll leave them off. And the humanities were largely non-communicative worlds at that remote time. I have no recollection at all of what led me to do so, but I presently found myself becoming much involved in following up with programs in both bodies, the Oriental Institute and anthropology. But indeed, within the social sciences also, with close and friendly contacts in particularly geography and history. The idea of pursuing an academic career occurred to me only several years later. A memorable paper by Donald Campbell a few years later caught my attention and still holds it. The title was The Ethnocentrism of Disciplines and the Fish Scale Model of Omniscience. I still do tend to ignore and overstep boundaries, but as Campbell also acknowledged, the ideal abstraction of fish scales, a seamless web in which different scales are overlapping with other regions immediately around them, is also a fundamental question that has to be dealt with. If you think only of fish scales, you find yourself ignoring problems of rigor and systematicity in thought and in making judgments about the quality of those who will succeed us. So both imposing and crossing boundaries are fundamental questions in a great university. Accepting the need for the former, what I want to talk to you about today is crossing boundaries. Particularly that between the social sciences and humanities, since that's where, in fact, I have found myself spending most of my life. We take it for granted and refer to it only in platitudes. Yet, in the abstract, there probably would not be much disagreement that knowledge ought to be have interdisciplinary boundaries extending even into the natural sciences, between the humanities and the social sciences and the natural sciences. Anthropology, in other words, is a good vantage point from which to pursue this, precisely because of its relative tolerance about boundaries. Relative may be an important word, but it nevertheless, I think, does characterize the state of the field in anthropology. Having taken up what goes, or maybe I should say what once went, on in the ancient Near East as a lasting subject of personal concern, I would like to choose examples from my own experience to illustrate why at crucial moments or turning points it can be useful or even imperative to confront different but interwoven themes in the complex problems that arise in any region if you're looking for its place in history. Mesopotamia, roughly the eastern half of the so-called Fertile Crescent, was the gift of the Tigris and Euphrates, and I'll have more to say about that presently, as they flowed down from the Anatolian plateau into an increasingly arid plain on their way to the Persian Gulf. It was an enormously creative place, and I don't need to say that in this room, but I don't know what other shoppers there might be in from coming here for the convocation that's just been concluded. Over a long period of time, one thinks of ancient cities and earliest literacy in Babylon and Ur and the royal cemetery of Ur and so on. Practically anything that was portable was carted off from ancient Mesopotamia to Western museums through at least the first third of the 20th century. America was rather late in getting into this business. 1870s or so, if you look at the whole of the United States at that time. Chicago, of course, came along as a university even a couple of decades after that. On the other hand, shortly after it came into being, with far-seeing, generous Rockefeller support, a leading international center of research arose right here in the Oriental Institute. Robert Braidwood was the first joint appointment with anthropology. I was the second. There have been none since I left for the Smithsonian a quarter of a century or so later in 1984, as you heard, for which I regard as a disappointment that there have been none. There are obviously all kinds of reasons and alternatives and priorities and so on. Perhaps what first brought the ancient Near East within the immediate field of vision of either the Oriental Institute or certainly of anthropology, as a model of study as a social science, was the work of V. Gordon Childe. He was a somewhat idiosyncratic British Marxist and an outstanding synthesizer of European prehistory. Childe had become in that field a person who was very important in overcoming badly balkanized ethnic rivalries that were crippling the whole prehistoric field. Coincidentally, Childe was also a convinced diffusionist. The great motto at that time was ex orienta lux, so that his interest always was in looking over his shoulder also, although he didn't begin to pursue this until about the early 1930s. And at that point, he then began to have a major influence. I guess it really came to a focus in the 1940s and early 50s on, among other fields, American anthropology. Man Makes Himself, and many other books, formulated major changes in the human career in terms of revolutions. As a prehistorian, he had little to say after the appearance of literate civilization, and never got down in time to the classical world, which for most of the, quote, West, unquote, has generally been considered its intellectual place of origins, and I'll come back to that. As a personal aside here, let me say, as the cultural and linguistic barriers to fully understanding the significance of ancient Oriental languages are gradually surmounted, there will eventually need to be a more circumscribed appraisal of the role of the classical world. I want to cite just one small but revelatory example from very recently published work. I'm quoting from a recent article of my own, which I'll just read through, but it's the work that I'm describing, not of my own, but of others. The cuneiform text first published in 1950, never previously recognized as other than a routine administrative document, turns out to disclose a totally unsuspected new genre of geometric solutions to a class of quadratic equations. This text, by the way, is somewhat earlier than 2000 BC. Among its few, perhaps only, practical uses is to provide for accurate divisions of land parcels of moderate size and irregular shape into tracts of exactly equal area. By no later than 2000 BC or so, we thus suddenly learn of the high likelihood that mathematically very proficient, regrettably anonymous scribes were providing solutions, professional services, to private clients in land inheritance cases, and doing so in this extraordinary fashion. An extension, perhaps some would tell me merely a demonstration of the extraordinary range of disciplined and intellectual thought in the third millennium already in Mesopotamia, comes into view here. It seems to me to extend well beyond the limits of at least my present knowledge of what lay within the horizons of even such great figures as Archimedes of the classical world. Provides us with a curiously long-reaching link all the way down to the Renaissance. I mention that merely as a sudden discovery of something already known for many decades, that indicates how much yet remains to be discovered. Child, at any rate, followed Lewis Henry Morgan's savagery, barbarism, civilization sequential classification. The first two terms are oddly colonial stereotypes, long out of use. These three were, so to speak, stages, which left two intervening transitions between them. Those became Child's Neolithic Revolution, which meant the arrival of sedentism and food production, and the Urban Revolution, vaguely bundling everything that was civilized, pre-imperial, complex, and most distinctively urban in character. What made Child think that these transitions were revolutionary? Presumably, new complexity was what that was assumed to arrive at an increasing tempo of change, was what he had in mind. But during most of Child's active life, and concentration on prehistoric time, embracing change in prehistoric times was still very fuzzy as to the measurement of time. Radiocarbon dating began to change this in the early 1950s. It's been much improved since, but frankly still, because of its plus-minus character, that it never produces absolute dates, but dates with a range of variability, problems still persist, and at least they impede the use of radiocarbon dating for detailed analyses of causality. Child thus should not be too harshly criticized for misreading the timing and duration of those two transitions. But what was also attached to his point of view was that these were fairly singular impulses, concentrated in some fashion. What they were not to Child was complex, multifaceted processes. As Lawrence Stone had once caught the attention of many of us in showing in an article on the British Civil War that became a sort of a standard in the 1960s. Child originally suggested criteria for the Neolithic were those of the time, of his time, that is to say, of sufficient size and obvious functionality for then prevailing archaeological approaches to recognize and recover domesticated plants and animals, rapid population growth, surplus storage, trade networks, fertility cults, groundstone tools, pottery, weaving, whatever. Robert Braidwood enters the scene here. Originally a lone prehistorian at the Oriental Institute, his evolutionary interests brought him also, somewhat later, into anthropology. Thus, he became one of the very first to take Child's ideas on the Neolithic revolution into the field in the ancient Near East, into prehistoric Jarmo in the Kurdish foothills of northern Iraq. Soon thereafter, Jarmo received one of the first of the radiocarbon dates, around 7000 BC. I followed him out to Jarmo as a graduate student field supervisor, still thinking of myself as a fledgling leftish journalist, not embarking on a career as an academician. Another one, just as an aside, another person who followed him out to that season was inclined to be wanted to be a biological anthropologist, and he jumped the gun, having gotten to Jarmo, and took an interest in the village of Kani Sard, from which our workmen were coming, and went off and began a distinguished career as a social anthropologist. This was Fred Barth. He and others soon discovered that Child's suggestively functionalist bundle of Neolithic traits were not simultaneous in their time of arrival. Pottery got to Jarmo only in its uppermost levels, while most of the other appurtenances of well-established village life were there from the beginning. To Braidwood at that time, and probably also to Child and most other prehistorians, the sense remained around for some time, that they were dealing with a single functionally interrelated, at least, bundle of traits, a web. Not a singular idea, probably, but an emergent pattern of some kind, originating in a small, somewhat exceptional region. That thinking went on for some time and led to the proprietary sniping as to who found what first. But shortly it became utterly clear that no perimeter could be drawn around something very complex and non-localized that was going on. Dealing with that something became almost a revolution of its own in the research process. There was an explosion of interdisciplinary work that has absolutely dominated that field of study during the following 6 decades until the present. Braidwood's crucial innovation for the Near East, the idea was also coming into use in less difficult and better settled regions, was to take with him into the field as full participants, close specialists in in 3 fields: paleobotany, paleozoology, and paleoclimatology. This is where interdisciplinary, directed at the most relevant natural sciences, reached into the picture, and now at least figuratively owns it. We now, today, know that the heavy human utilization of potentially domesticable animals and plants, and presumably human attempts at first just to encourage their availability, began at least 20,000 years ago, and that at least another 10,000 years were to follow before anything we can yet trace on the domestication of animals can be detected. Enormous lengthening of the time, in other words. And this involves changes that reach far beyond the morphology of the bones that, of course, were subject then, and in most cases, perhaps, grow out of the interactive behaviors of the humans who were encountering these animals and the animals themselves, in terms of the age at death, of the difference between male and female species, and so on. And then, as a matter of fact, as I've just suggested, morphologically distinguishable animals on the road to domestication probably are something on the order of 10,000 years later than the beginnings of plant domestication. We now know, too, that many of the different clusterings of domestication, as we first knew them at that time, occupied an area that might be on the order of 2 million square kilometers in extent, running all across southern Turkey and northern Iran, and then coming down to form this Fertile Crescent, but to form it on its outskirts through Syria and Israel on the west, along the Mediterranean, and then down along the Iraq, what is now the Iraq-Iran border, in the Zagros Mountains on the east. There were separate pockets, we also now know, for example, in which first goat remains, and then elsewhere remains of sheep, and then still elsewhere those of cattle and pigs were being experimented with and were being modified in their life terms or whatever, so that we could identify them. Unexpectedly, there is a very recent news of a possible need for a further huge upward extension of this area which I've just spoken about in the ancient Near East. I have just encountered, in fact, in science within the last month or so, references to the crop of millet, domesticated in North China, and now it seems clear that something on the order of 10,000 years is involved in China for that domestication to go forward. In other words, it is very nearly as early as anything in the Near East. What is really exciting and perplexing here is the immense distance that extends at a time relatively simultaneously of this going on in Eastern Asia and in Southwestern Asia. Now, the advantage of millet, which we in the Near East have never really thought of as a serious part of the food crop complex, is that it has an extraordinarily short germination period, as little as 45 days, and always between 45 and 60. This makes it an extremely well-adapted plant for being able to move with people who are moving, in any case, across arid Asia over immense distances. And it helps account for the fact that millet did come, certainly by around 5000 BC or so, into what we might call the Black Sea region of southeastern Europe. So here is something which, because there are still questions to be asked about it, we can't take it yet as definite, but stay tuned as the possibility looms that a new jump in timing and scale may have to be somehow accommodated into our thinking. It has now also become classic that we can no longer envision any single broad-scale prime mover of change, climate or otherwise, among environmental factors, or perhaps among multiple contributing human factors, such as attempts to reduce risk or to balance predictability of different foods at different times of the year. All must have been operating at times and places along with strictly local human factors. Human intent as a rational, organizing, comprehensive, and intelligible factor, however, was probably very late in this system. Melinda Zader, whose name may be known to some of you, she is also at the Smithsonian Institution, I should say, has recently given a fine overview of all this in a monograph in the Journal of Archaeological Research, and another major article appeared about a year ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. You may have noticed that even as I describe this to you, the pronoun we begins to creep in, but while finally settling into a life pursuit of new knowledge in an ancient landscape, as this suggests, while I was involved in that prospect. My own participation in anything Neolithic ended after that one long season at Jarmo. The urban revolution attracted my attention as a direction of long-term research instead, the second of Charles' transitions, but seemed at that time too diffusely focused to take up directly. Charles' urban revolution, as he conceived of it, was a fundamentally different kind of entity than the Neolithic revolution. The ruined remains and many of the lasting achievements of major early cities in a half a dozen or so of the world's earliest centers of civilization were already known long before his time. Looting and organized excavating, the two not always readily distinguishable in the early days, brought about a flow of removable findings into Western collections, and eventually into the increasingly fierce debate today over who owns the past. A large part of it ultimately, fortunately, finding its way into museums. Cities are always, almost always at least, long-lived, and in the Near East especially so. Unlike the earliest sedentary communities groping their way into husbandry, cities grew over one another for centuries or millennia, mostly leaving behind great depth of debris in levels that are rarely level and further disrupted by ancient pits. There would be prohibitive expense in excavating down through later, far more extensive overlying deposits to their earliest origins. That would also require the unthinkable obliteration of the historic monuments of their later greatness. Similar concepts, similar considerations all over the world led in the post-World War II period to the development of archaeological surveys as largely lateral rather than excavational means of filling the gap of no less than several millennia between early sedentary communities and urban civilization. With this in mind, upon finally finishing my dissertation and joining both the anthropology staff and the Oriental Institute here, I embarked on what was to become a comprehensive survey of the lower Mesopotamian plain. The primary goal was not the kind of systematic survey that is completely intensive, that is now people take pride in, but it was to decipher the sequence of larger patterns of irrigation, of the ancient river patterns and so on, and then to try to date those patterns of the movement of water by means of making collections on the adjoining mounds that would provide a dating system for the whole of the watering system. The means of detection at that time was traveling around partly on foot and partly in beat-up Land Rovers or whatever, and making use of aerial photographs, which were all we had then and which we did regard as marvelous. Now, of course, they've been more than replaced and vastly improved upon by satellite imagery, some of which now is wonderfully geo-rectified. That turned out to be a large order, It occupied me through 3 books, many field seasons, and 2 decades, and called upon the contribution of many colleagues as well. Not a few of them also trained here in Chicago. It involved a major new learning experience, entirely outside the realm of studies dealing with people and cities. The natural topography of the Mesopotamian plain looks serene and timeless, but this is deceptive. It is always in motion. Fierce wind erosion and deposition, flooding, river course avulsions that make long-term accurate mapping hopeless, salinization, and of course all of the other intended and unintended changes imposed by human action. Fluvial geomorphology becomes a new and indispensable field of interdisciplinary study. And it's one in which some of the most pioneering and important work has been carried on by the U.S. Geological Survey on the great North American rivers. But perhaps its most important and unexpected product was the light our findings turned out to have on the attainment of urban life. In a word, we found an urban revolution in southern Mesopotamia, going on through essentially all of the 4th millennium BC. At its base were many score of previously discovered hamlets and villages surmounted by a hierarchy of towns of ascending size. Knitting them all together at the top was the great primate city of Uruk, 400 hectares, let's say square mile and a half or so, probably not less than 50,000 inhabitants, although we have no real way of reaching for an accurate approximation. This it had become already by the middle of the 4th millennium, by say 3,500 or so BC. Let's say 200 or so hectares, maybe even 250, and it gives you some sense that there really was an ascending scale of development here that would have been perceptible within people's lifetimes. And does that make a revolution? It certainly comes nearer to making one than what else we could have dealt with. In a sense, much of this was hardly a surprise. Ancient Sumer in southern Mesopotamia was earliest through the urban transition. We already, I think, were quite clear that was the case. And then to cap it off, Hans Nissen, a colleague of mine and a close friend, with whom I had surveyed out of the German base in ancient Uruk, went back to Berlin's Free University, after a stay at the Oriental Institute for several years, and put together a German-American team that succeeded in the extraordinary effort to interpret the hundreds of clay tablets that had been found many years earlier in Uruk, at first with only pictographs, and then tracing the evolution of those pictographs and the system of pictographs into literate Sumerian that we could in fact fully translate. The sequel to that wonderful time of discovery, only too familiar to all of us here in this realm and in fact in this country, indeed to the world, was the crushingly tragic beginning only 2 years or so after the overthrow of the Iraqi monarchy that had been installed by the British a couple of decades earlier in 1958. And then the increasing violence and repressiveness that began within a couple of years and continued through the truly tyrannical figure of Saddam Hussein. For all I and many others had done there, that was seemingly the end. My applications for permits to continue surveying over further regions were denied after the mid-70s, probably because that work began to seem a little too much like a form of intelligence. 8 years or so of war with Iran followed. Then shortly the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. I happened to be back in Iraq just a week or two before that broke out. Then the first Gulf War, then the invasion of Iraq itself after a decade of sanctions and boycotts and what have you, increasing suspicion and paralysis. All field research ended, even in old, well-established excavations. During a decade or so of this grim time, as already been mentioned, I went to Washington to run the Smithsonian Institution. That was a more concentrated exercise, if I can say so, in having to transgress disciplines continuously than any I can imagine. And it's just possible that it was precisely that they got me for it. But my old attachment to the ancient Near East has never gone away. And in more recent years, I find myself actively pursuing it under yet another fresh approach and transdisciplinary hat. More than 100,000 excavated Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform tablets repose safely in the world's museums. Not a small proportion of them still unread or at least unstudied. After a century or so, since most of that number came out in looting in the late 19th and early 20th century. Not formally trained in Assyriology, although around Assyriology in every sense of the word during all my years here and into its literature, and with an extensive knowledge of much of that literature acquired over decades, I find myself concerned now with the evolving product of interacting natural and human forces. And once again, from that standpoint, if you wish, seeing the possibility of an interdisciplinary convergence. My stance these days has become that of a contextualist, if there is such a word, actively involved in ongoing discussions with Assyriological textualist colleagues and friends. For many of their less adventurous, more discipline-bound colleagues, fidelity to existing cuneiform documents is regarded as the first and overriding responsibility. That leaves a place for someone with my background to step back and, in peer-reviewed Assyriological journals, call attention to what is missing or ignored or misunderstood or contradictory or problematic in ways that invite new lines of inquiry. What comes into focus in this framework are arrestingly different basic themes that are difficult to find convincing resolutions for without the benefit of carefully considered imposed or opposed alternatives that are taken up in a serious and direct way. Merchants, for example, were by the nature of their activities transgressors of both geographic and social boundaries. Over time, it has become clear that they moved toward enhanced status and eventually independence of action, and one might also toward increasing wealth. Similarly, a gradually increasing status and wider role is apparent for private secular institutions at the level of extended families or business consortia and for local civic, judicial, and other bodies. Much of that is, in fact, involved closely with the work of Andrea Seri, who's now here at the Oriental Institute on the faculty. This has led to the emergence of over time, of new strata of social networks. Stakeholders might be a common word today in use. I think the term is most common in Germany, but it's one we know too, with communatory interests to protect and pursue. From a more narrow textualist standpoint, on the other hand, this instead may appear as closer to the oscillation back and forth of a pendulum without any consistent developmental or evolutionary aspect to it. Some combination, at least, of these two perspectives clearly did go on, and it is around this that one can frame ongoing discussions in which I am involved with people who certainly are in the leadership in the field of Assyriology. Are we looking only at the waxing and waning of subordinate strata who remained in the end under the control of powerful dynasties? Or was it the fact that the dynasties were both waxing and waning, suggestive of the powers that they increasingly acquired during those times of waning, and that led to something more important? Without directly challenging dynastic control, in other words, to what extent did non-state structures become complementary and sometimes even decisive on issues such as dispute resolution or markets and land ownership. How did an originally temple and state-dominated system of corvée labor and allotted rationing gradually give way to wage labor coming out of rations without any immediate replacement of terminology, unfortunately, which is always a problem when you're confined only to thinking of things in terms of what the texts themselves say. Then there are different categories of slavery embraced by a single term, palace and temple slavery on the one hand, or private household slavery on the other, that escape any comprehensive form of reckoning and that require and that remain to be differentiated as to their forms of behavior. I'm currently involved in close ongoing discussions with someone who's never been on the Oriental Institute faculty here, but I'm sure is known to many of you, Wolfgang Heimpel, recently retired in Berkeley, who is the man who has done the work on this perfectly extraordinary Darshana archive that's now available in a volume which is transformative in what it has to say, even from a narrowly textualist point of view, but which on some of these underlying issues like slavery is confronting us with wonderful new data, but also with much more perplexing problems that we're a long way from trying to solve. Heimpel is, not having been aware of that even at the time he was preparing that volume for publication, is now aware of the problematicity, so to speak, of the slave or non-slave category of people in that enormous project, which is involving. It was aborted. It never was finished, but was involving up to 1,500 employees. And then it's also fascinating that it seems that most of those employees were free hires. We have people slopping around in the system for which there is no record in the OR archives, and that gives us all kinds of further vantage points for looking further at this system. By what means, as all these questions of definition come into focus, can we define the overall importance of slavery and in the economy? How different in status and actual treatment were some of these different categories that we now begin to see emerging, although nobody ever takes the trouble to give us a potted definition of them. How do we begin to reassess the role of women in a society traditionally thought of as patriarchal when new texts from Darshana show us a different picture? At that time, around 2000 BC, we find, even though this is a traditionally patriarchal society, we find women as the dominant foreman on the project in number and in the number of people, men and women, that are on the teams they're controlling. And when we find further that the women who were employed are not employed merely in feminine crafts like textile production, they are the dominant brick carriers. Well, as you see, almost everything we touch when we go after texts from a point of view which is prepared to see these problems can expose new opportunities for conversations which may or may not change anyone's point of view, but which raise all kinds of new perspectives. How much of the terrain and population within the ill-defined limits of these ancient realms was actually under the control in any serious way of the dynasties that were supposedly dominant there? These are representative of areas of ignorance that even huge numbers of texts often fail to deal with completely. They need to be better understood by asking different questions. Still more difficult and basic to what extent did tribal Scrabble training procedures produce people who were active agents of the regime that was employing them? Or were they simply passive bookkeepers under higher levels of surveillance? And people like Piotr Steinkeller have already opened up that issue to a degree by discovering that so many of the records were post hoc in their recording, long after, months after the so-called work was performed. But that's just opening up a corner of it that we have to go further with. A general feature of all such research along these lines is that it's not merely interdisciplinary, but that boundaries dissolve and joint efforts begin to look for new and unexpected answers. And that, in a word, is the main goal when I come up with a title like Transgressing Disciplines in a great university like this. I thank you.
Time for some questions.
Yeah. I'm having a hard time with a dim light out there. I may not see a hand, so
okay.
Wave something, or maybe there are none. Wouldn't that be nice?
That would be good. Well, I have one.
No.
You know, and putting together the introduction too, I was thinking about the project of comparing, the old world and new world, early states, and although there's a lot of discussion about the comparative project in anthropology, it's not something that really much happens anymore.
No. Yes.
But I wondered what your thoughts on that.
Well, part of the problem, obviously I think a lot about it, and part of the problem is that where you don't have texts, you're driven to model building. And models are seductive. And I'm not saying there's any other better alternative if there's nothing that provides direct access, at least potentially direct access to the minds and the motivations of actors. But where we begin to discover what I'm personally working on, and nothing else, as a matter of fact, at this point, you begin to discover that you can dig deeper where we do have text. I don't find much use for models, so I really don't. They're too simple. They give us a stratum out of many strata of possible motivation, and they don't allow us to see any of the complexities or interactions between those different strata. And so that I don't really find that I spend any time looking at models anymore, and I hate to say that. Now, it's also true that in the Maya area in particular, are we getting further with what's coming out of the Maya inscriptions? I'm not sure, because those are in stone, and that represents a different kind of a more formal enunciation of something that is quite different. My hope, frankly, as I look at the Assyriological record, is that someday people will get serious about stuff that they have really not yet paid much attention to. For the Old Babylonian period, there are 5,000 letters. So basically, I think that we have to work with what we have. And where we do not have primary documents, with all of the defects that primary documents have, and anyone who's worked on the Assyriological archives knows what is left absolutely beyond anyone's attention, because it isn't there to be immediately extracted, knows how frustrating that is. But my interest is in staying with that and in letting that become part of a frontier of anthropology rather than simply model building. That's the only answer I can give.
Sorry about that. So it was interesting that you mentioned how when we're looking at these new points of inquiry, where sometimes it requires us to, instead of finding something like interdisciplinary, we're looking for something more adisciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
But my question then was, does this merely create a new discipline? For instance,
does this really do what?
Does this merely create a new discipline? For instance, if we look at the way that, if we look at the history of are the history and philosophy of science.
Yeah.
Peter Galston at Harvard talks about something called trading zones.
Yeah.
Various disciplines actually work as a marketplace and they exchange ideas,
Yeah.
but then they do it through a functional language. But when we come to a turning point that you've spoken of, it seems that this language fails to deal with it. It's almost like a situation where you have a Tower of Babel, so to speak. And so then from there, do we just create a new discipline at that point, or with our, or if we succeed to address these questions, do we create a new discipline, or are we just? And if that's the case, then do we not go up the hierarchy of abstraction?
I think my answer to that would be that we're peeling another layer of skin off an endless onion. We don't know what goes beyond what. That there's nothing to say that we won't find further ways to dig deeper and so on. And I won't even say that we may not find that models are a line of insight that leads us to ways to dig deeper. So I wouldn't want this to be taken as a restriction on all of these things being employed where they work for us at present, and with the understanding that we may have to find new ways to combine them or to go beyond them. That's all I can say. I don't know what more to say. Is there a question there? Yes.
In your autobiographical account about your own involvement in these different generations of what one would call interdisciplinarity, what strikes me as rather interesting is that you yourself exemplify a kind of oscillation in terms of being very much dependent upon paleobotany, geomorphology, and so forth for certain kinds of things. And as you look more and more closely at these rich sites, you realize that in fact the archive itself, in the sense of the philologically based sciences, if one may call them that, become another kind of ancillary or handmaiden to your investigation. And then perhaps in some future time it will be more scientific kind of collaboration.
Well, I think that may very well be the case. I think that there had to be a recognition of an area of phenomena, so to speak, involving the landscape and the modifications to it, and the forces that were at work, and how human involvement in those forces was itself a deformation and a transformation and so on. We had to go through a discovery of this, and then to discover that, in fact, very good people had worked on the question of the interactions between rivers and human beings. And without becoming geomorphologists, we had to see what kinds of questions they asked and where they took them and so on, and then take that back to our own very different field. I don't think it's ever involved becoming geomorphologists, although I would say that, particularly in the person of Tony Wilkinson, who was here for many years and who is really the sort of the father of landscape archaeology, I guess. He has in fact remained just that, but he's become nevertheless recognized as such an exponent of that he becomes a figure in the dialogue by himself. I mean, he's done it exactly the way that I think it should be done, and I don't think we can predict what these patterns will be and where we will find individuals with the propensity to take them up. It really is disappointing to me that we haven't found people. We haven't somehow seen people who would want to bridge the transition themselves. We have people who have taken a little bit of the textual material, or who have concentrated on the textual material and done a little bit of work in excavations and so on. But the kind of people who were effortlessly moving back and forth across that entire bridge, that's a very demanding thing to have happen. And I regret to say it hasn't happened in a really effective way that I'm talking about here in the Oriental Institute, which was as good a place it could have happened as any. And yet, one of these days it has to happen. And I guess that's really all I can say. And I do think that somehow, particularly at a time when you can't get into the damn country, and when you therefore have an opportunity to reflect with more detachment and maybe even a little more leisure on these things, it ought to be a primary concern here. I don't know what else I can say.
Doesn't it become a conflict, though, between the fact that you have to train individuals in terms of what has been discovered and what has been expounded to the detriment of a more generalist approach to the situation?
I mean, what has been discovered is in itself, by its specificity, therefore a detriment to a more general approach?
Become buried in data, and so you erect barriers to the cross-disciplinary approach.
Well, it seems to me that good historians are dealing and have dealt with this maybe since the Greeks, with precisely that problem of the jarring specificity of particular pieces of data, and with the need to develop a long-term approach and so on. This is what the Annals school was really took on as its major focus in the middle of the 20th century, and I think it's something we struggle for, and we struggle for in different ways, and I feel very much a part of that struggle without having a clear feeling that there's any particular avenue of resolution to it that I can see. Okay?
I think we've come to the end of our time, so we would take